The voices of the departing congregation carried quite clearly across the grass and tombstones, and at any moment she expected to hear that dreaded voice demanding that she return at once if she knew what was good for her. Not until she was safely inside the vicarage did her hands unclench. That man could hardly barge in here and drag her out. "Why don't you sit down at the table and I'll make you a nice cup of tea? We all had a bit of a shock in church today, and it must be even harder for you." As Mrs. Jackson busied herself at the old-fashioned range, Jane was able to steady her breathing, regain her composure, and begin to take stock of the situation. "Arthur and I have talked about that man more than once. How he could sit in the pew every Sunday as if butter wouldn't melt when he was so wicked I don't know. I'm sure that he's not the only parent who thinks a good hiding is an acceptable form of punishment when any of their offspring disobey or misbehave. Children are regularly caned, get the strap or some such thing whilst in school. My 2 boys got the occasional slapped leg, but no more than that. I had a brother, you know, a twin, but he died at birth. My father's never forgiven me for that." A mug of tea was placed in front of her, and she cradled her hands around it. She shook her head when she was offered a piece of fruit-cake. "You are far too thin, my dear, if you'll forgive me for saying so. Were you not fed, either?" "I'm naturally slender, Mrs. Jackson, but have lost weight since I left school in July. I just can't swallow food when sitting at the same table as him." "Arthur said you were looking for a secretarial job. Did you learn to be a shorthand typist at your grand school?" "I did. The headmistress suggested it might be a useful skill, even for the daughters of the very rich who intend to marry well and do nothing at all with their lives." "Well, that's going to change and no mistake. This war's been coming for a long time, and everyone will have to do their bit. Both my boys signed up last year, and both are pilot officers. James is a fighter pilot, and David will be training the new boys." "Then at least one of your sons won't be in constant danger once the fighting starts." Her tea remained undrunk. She jumped every time she heard a noise, dreading who might appear in the door. Mrs. Jackson stopped trying to engage her in conversation and continued with the preparation for Sunday lunch. The wireless crackled and hummed, almost drowning out the suitably serious music that was being played. Then the back door opened, and the vicar called out cheerfully, "I have your belongings, Jane, and your mother had already written a letter, which she slipped into my hand as I left." The wave of relief almost crushed her, and for a few seconds she was unable to move or respond. Then her world righted, and she sprung to her feet, just catching the back of the chair in time to prevent it crashing to the floor. "Thank you so much, Mr. Jackson." He handed her an envelope and a small suitcase. "I got the impression that your mother was aware of your plans. She certainly didn't have time to write such a thick letter so quickly." "She knew I intended to volunteer as soon as war was declared, but I never discussed the specifics with her. Arthur, can you show Jane where she'll be sleeping tonight?" She was familiar with the downstairs layout of the vicarage, as over the years she had attended afternoon tea, Bible classes and Sunday school there. However, she'd never been upstairs. "Here you are, my dear. You might as well sleep in James's room, as the bed is made up with clean linen. The bathroom is at the end of the passage, the WC adjacent. Come down when you're ready." He vanished, leaving her to examine her temporary surroundings. James was 4 years older than her, and she'd always admired him from afar. He looked exactly like his father, medium build, mouse-brown hair and blue eyes similar to her own. David was a couple of years older, and she'd had very little to do with him. She dropped her suitcase on the floor. No point in unpacking, as she was only going to be there for one night. Thank goodness she was wearing her Sunday best, and could travel to London knowing she looked like an adult, as for once she was wearing silk stockings, smart navy court shoes, and a pretty floral-printed frock, with a nipped-in waist and matching belt. Her cardigan was navy, as was her hat. This was more a fancy beret than an actual hat, but it served its purpose. Her everyday clothes consisted of skirts and blouses with Peter Pan collars, worn with white ankle socks and her school shoes. All she had in her suitcase were changes of underwear, nightclothes, her stationery folder, and her toiletries. Inside this leather folder was her precious post office savings book, her identity card and her ration book. She was hoping that she would be issued with a uniform once she was in...